Hello, my name is Michael Lakey. I'm your tutor for the second half of the module New Testament Studies. The module code is TMM2051. And I'm very glad to be with you, and I'm speaking to you from the vicarage at Chalgrove. And I'm glad to be with you for the second half of the term because I get to talk about the Apostle Paul and his epistles. And the Apostle Paul has been my great fascination for really the past 20 years. And we're going to be focusing this half term on the epistles to the Corinthians, so 1st Corinthians and 2nd Corinthians. But for this first session, we're going to be looking at background issues. And for this first video, for this first session, we're going to be thinking about dating. Now, I probably need to explain what I mean by dating. So how do we date? How do we locate Paul's epistles in history? And how do we locate the Apostle Paul in history? And they may seem like difficult, but ultimately resolvable questions. But the real picture is a good deal more complicated. And what I'd like to do is ask you to imagine the history of the Bible that you may have on your desk or on your settee or wherever you're watching this video, to think about the Bible, the history of that Bible, how it came to be. And I don't mean where you bought it from. Rather, it's an English Bible, and the texts of the New Testament, as we have them, are written in Greek. So there's a process of translation. But the texts of the New Testament, as we have them, are a diverse, not horribly diverse, but quite diverse set of texts. We've got lots and lots and lots of examples of texts dating from, a period of about 1,000 years that the translators work with. And these texts have modest amounts of differences between them. And of course that makes sense. There were copies and copies of copies and copies of copies of copies, and these copies are all we've got. We don't have the original. And there's about a period of 180 years between the writing of some New Testament epistles and our earliest big sections of original. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, it would be an example of our earliest full texts for some materials in the New Testament. And that's at the close of the second, beginning of the 3rd century. And so what we've got is an English translation of a text which was the result of scholars sitting down and looking at all of the manuscripts, all of the fragments, all of the minuscules and their tiny little bits of text, and all of the biblical quotations that we've been able to amass as part of our historical activities. And these scholars, called text critics, put it all together and try and work out what the lineage of these different variations might be, so that we're able to then say, well, which is earlier than the other, which is better attested than the other, which is more reliable than the other, and how we might hypothesize an original manuscript, given that we don't have an original manuscript. And so we've got a process of translation, a process of assembling manuscripts and traditions and compiling a critical text. And then we've got you know, centuries of church history in which these variations occurred, and then we've got a quiet 180 years where we have no access to that, and then we've got the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul, and the task of the historian is how to put all of that together. And so we're not going to be able to do that in a 15 or 20-minute video. Rather, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you it's jolly difficult, that the complexity of that process means that we should be both confident and cautious about the way in which we interpret biblical materials. Confident because it's a process that the text critics have been at for a very long time. Cautious because human beings are not infallible. And it should encourage us to a degree of interpretative humility. What we're actually trying to do is to put what the scholars give us in some sort of historical setting. So, what can we know about the Apostle Paul? Well, even if you were to bench all of those questions that attach to, you know, the historicity of manuscripts, the reliability of the manuscripts that we've got, and I do think that the Bible that we have is basically reliable. It's very reliably similar to what I think the autographs, the original manuscripts, would have been. But even if we were to bench all of those questions, there's a real question of, well, how do we do historical interpretation? And the best way of asking this would be to say, well, what are the different sorts of evidence? What constitutes evidence? And if you've done any history, you might be familiar with the language of primary and secondary sources. And that's important for the study of Paul because the New Testament records primary sources, Paul purporting to be in Paul's own words, and then Paul on the lips of other writers, specifically Luke in Acts, which mentions the ministry of Paul quite a bit. And, you know, if I was to ask you, well, how much weight do we give primary sources over secondary sources? That's a real question. I'm not going to pause artificially in the course of a video like I would if we were having this lecture in my church or in a hall somewhere. But this would be a point at which I would naturally invite you to pause and have a discussion or have a think. And one of the reasons for that is that it's an important question. And we might jump to thinking, Paul in his own words is always more reliable than Paul in the words of others. But actually that isn't a principle that we usually apply to questions of history generally. Would we favour Stalin in his own words or Hitler in his own words, and we have those words, over a recent secondary source which spoke from a vantage point of maybe 2 or 3 decades and which wasn't corrupted by either an impetus to be self-serving or or a whole series of ideological concerns. So in other words, there are questions of, well, what makes for reliable history? And being close to the event isn't always the best way of getting to the truth of that event. So the fact that Paul is a primary source and Luke is a secondary source doesn't immediately mean that we neglect Luke. But the gap between that 180 odd year gap between, some of our earliest manuscripts and the writings of the New Testament autographs ought to caution us not to assume that when Luke writes about Paul, that he's writing with great familiarity. He might be, he might not be. Depends what we think the historicity of Luke might be. And that's a live question among Luke scholars. What do we do about those passages in Acts where Luke talks about Paul and himself as we? I'm not going to resolve those questions here. Simply, I'm going to say that we are not going to assume either too much of a disjunction between Paul and Luke. We're not going to assume that we're preferring Luke to Paul or preferring Paul to Luke. We're simply going to look for nuggets of evidence, fully aware that this is a probabilistic process, and fully aware that we're not infallible. So let's have a look at some of the evidence from Acts. Well, firstly, number one on the list on the screen, Luke describes Paul as a neanias, which is literally a young man at the time Stephen was martyred, which was, within a few years of the death of Jesus. According to Jerome Murphy O'Connor, the term neaniskos, which means something similar to neanias, was in some traditions a designation for a man in his 20s. Now, what this means is it means that Paul was, if Luke is to be taken as decisive evidence, Paul would have been in his 20s at some time in the early 30s. So that means Paul could have been born within a few years of Jesus, being slightly younger. So that's one possible piece of information. Let's think of another. Well, Paul's mission to Athens and the area of Greece south of that, it's an area known as the Peloponnese. And it includes Corinth, so it's important for this part of the course. That is dated by Luke as being when a man called Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the governor. And Achaia was the province of which Corinth was the key port. And there is some inscription evidence which dates Gallio's proconsulship to what's called the 26th acclamation of Caesar Claudius. Now, when was a Caesar acclaimed, and what was an acclamation of Caesar Claudius? It was when the good news that a particular Caesar was on the throne went out to the entire empire. And the Romans, being quite good record keepers, we know when that was. It was probably July the 1st AD 51. And so, according to Luke, Paul was in Corinth on July the 1st, AD 51, probably. And Luke says that Paul was in Corinth for about 18 months and that he left thereafter. And of course that makes it quite difficult to date him precisely, because was he there for 17 months, then Gallio became proconsul and then he left? Or was he there for a month, Gallio was proconsul, and then he was there for a long time afterwards? We're not told. I suspect probably the first. I suspect he was there for a while, Gallio became proconsul, and then he left. And so if we imagine Paul writing to the church in Corinth within a couple of years, this gives us dates of 53 to 55 for 1 Corinthians. 53 being an earlier date, 55 being if he stayed a little longer and took a little bit longer to write. And of course, the first thing that we would note is that there's quite a long gap between event number 1, Stephen's martyrdom, and event number 2, Paul's mission to the Peloponnese. It's about 20 years. And this is different from the time elapsed between Paul's conversion and the visit to Corinth. Paul tells us a little bit about his conversion and a bit about the events that happened thereafter in the first chapters of Galatians. And he also alludes to being in Damascus in 2 Corinthians. And we can date when he was in Damascus on the basis of who was king, who was ruler there at the time. Also, the visit to Corinth comes roughly midway in Luke's account of Paul's ministry. Hence, there's a hiatus between Paul's conversion and the beginning of the ministry, about 20 years. And then but some of that 20 years, Paul will have been active in ministry. And so where we plot Paul's movements will depend upon, how closely we mesh the evidence that we might get from the Pauline epistles with the evidence, if it is evidence, that we might get from Luke. And so I think we're left without certainty as to how tightly Luke and the epistles might tie together, but we are left in principle with some events, Paul's career as an opponent of the church, a conversion or a calling, then a period before he began to minister, then a ministry, and then rocking up in Corinth about halfway through his ministry, if Luke is to be believed, on July AD 51, actually being in Corinth. There are some questions as to what evidence there might be for a more precise timescale. What information is given about the duration of Paul's various missionary visits? Why is the length of the gap between his conversion and his ministry important? And it is important because it crops up in Galatians. What else might Luke say about Paul that contributes to his historical, how we reconstruct him historically? Luke says he was a freeborn Roman citizen. Does Paul ever mention that in the epistles? Well, no. The only time he talks about being a citizen is in Philippians, when he talks about being a citizen of heaven. Luke locates Paul in Tarsus in the province of Cilicia. Is that right? Or more to the point, if it is right, what does it tell us about the kind of Jew Paul might have been? It tells us he was educated in Jerusalem by Gamaliel. And Paul tells us he was an adherent of the strictest tradition of Judaism. And there might be a tension there. Gamaliel was by tradition a rabbi in what's called the Hillelite school, and they tended to be more permissive, whereas the strictest of the rabbinic traditions tended to be the tradition of Shammai. But Paul claims to have been educated by Gamaliel. Does the strictest tradition of Judaism simply refer to being a Pharisee? See, it's not always clear what a piece of evidence might mean. But these are important questions. And what you'll find is different commentators will weight these pieces of evidence differently. So let's have a look at where some scholars have located the writings of Paul. So on the left, you've got the dates attributed to the writings of the New Testament by a scholar called Marcus Borg. And on the right, you've got the dates attributed to a set of scholars. You've got the dates attributed to the New Testament writings by a set of scholars called Carson, Moo, and Morris. And what you'll find is that Carson, Moo, and Morris differ slightly from Borg as to whether Galatians and First Thessalonians was first. For Carson, Moo, and Morris, it's Galatians. For Borg, it's First Thessalonians. Interestingly, we can see that for Carson, Moo, and Morris, First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians are close together in time, whereas Second Thessalonians, if you're Borg, let's find him, doesn't crop up until about AD 100. That's because Borg doesn't believe that Paul wrote Second Thessalonians, like many scholars, but by no means all. And so when things are dated will depend, at least in part, upon whether we believe Paul wrote them. And actually it isn't clear to scholars that Paul wrote all of the epistles that are attributed to him in the New Testament. So let's scoot back just for a moment. So for Borg, it's First Thessalonians, then Galatians, then 52 to 54, 1 Corinthians, Philemon, mid-50s, Philippians, mid-50s, 55 to 57, 2 Corinthians, and 58, Romans. For Carson, Moo, and Morris, it's Galatians, then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians AD 55, 2 Corinthians AD 56, Romans AD 57, Titus AD 57, Colossians late 50s, Philemon late 50s, Philippians late 50s, early 60s, Colossians early 60s. And then we see that there are some asterisks, and that's because Carson, Moo, and Morris are summarising the work of others, and some scholars think that Colossians is earlier, some scholars think Colossians is later, same with Philemon and Ephesians. We'll notice that again when we get to the 90s, and Carson, Moo, and Morris have included a second Ephesians in their list with some asterisks, because some scholars think Ephesians was written about AD 90, for example, Borg. And then the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy and Titus, for Borg, these are early 2nd century. Paul didn't write them, it was somebody attributing them to Paul. So what we'll find is that there's a group of letters, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians and Romans, and Philippians, and Philemon, that almost all scholars attribute to Paul. So the big 7. And the other 6, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, and the 3 pastoral epistles, they tend to get dated earlier or later, depending on whether scholars believe that Paul actually wrote them. And some of the reasons for dating are to do with the style of Greek, and these are solid artistic reasons for thinking that that these might be written by somebody else. Some reasons for dating them later are to do with theology, and in my view, saying that a particular idea is late because we've decided that's a late sort of idea is a very circular way of dating something. I'd personally want something much stronger than that. And so if you pressed me, I would be one of those scholars who believes that at the very least 10 of the epistles were written by Paul. So everything apart from the 3 pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, I would certainly attribute to Paul. And my reasons for wondering about the pastoral epistles tend to be primarily to do with the style of the Greek. I'm aware that these are probabilistic judgments, but almost everything about the New Testament is a probabilistic judgment, and we make judgments based upon what we think is the most reliable way of viewing a particular text. So anyway, scooting forward, we're at the end of our session on dating Paul. So I'm going to put you back on full screen, and I'm going to say thank you for watching this video. There will be some other videos to watch for this first session in the second half of term. If you have any questions, do write them down and bring them with you to the Zoom tutorial, which we'll be having next Wednesday. Okay, take care. Thank you for watching.